The morning Clara Winslow walked up to the doors of the territorial bank of Coldwater Creek. The sun had barely cracked the eastern ridge, and she carried inside her chest the kind of quiet desperation that only a woman who has buried her husband and nearly lost her land can truly understand. The year was 1878, and the town of Coldwater Creek sat in the heart of the New Mexico Territory like a dust-covered jewel nobody had gotten around to polishing yet. The main street was a long stretch of packed earth, lined with a mercantile, a livery stable, a saloon that stayed open later than was decent, a post office that doubled as a telegraph station, and the First Territorial Bank, which was the most formidable-looking building on the block's solid red brick with iron bars on the windows, and a front door made of thick oak that would not open until 8 o'clock sharp each morning. Clara arrived at 7:30. She stood on the boardwalk in front of those closed doors wearing her best black dress, the one she had worn to Daniel's funeral 14 months ago and had since mended twice at the hem. Her dark brown hair was pinned neatly beneath a modest bonnet, and her hands, which had grown rough from working the land herself since Daniel passed, were folded tightly together in front of her. She was 32 years old, with green eyes that could be warm as spring grass or hard as river stone depending on what the day required, and today they were firmly the latter. She had rehearsed what she intended to say 17 times, standing in front of the small, cracked mirror in the bedroom of the Winslow homestead, which sat 5 miles east of town on 40 acres of land that she had been slowly losing ground on for over a year. The bank held the note on that land. The note was due in full in 12 days, and the man inside those iron-barred walls, a banker by the name of Gerald Ashworth, had already told her once, in a manner she found both condescending and dismissive, that the bank would not be extending any further leniency. She intended to convince him otherwise. The morning air was cool and carried the scent of sage and horse and the faint sweetness of wood smoke from the bakery 2 doors down. A rooster crowed somewhere behind the livery. Clara shifted her weight from one foot to the other and stared at the brass handle on the bank door as though she could will it to turn by sheer determination. She did not hear the boots on the boardwalk behind her until they stopped. The man who came to stand a few feet to her left was tall, broad-shouldered, and wearing the kind of unhurried stillness that a person either earns through years of hard work or is simply born with. He had dark hair that curled slightly at the collar of his flannel shirt, and a jaw dusted with several days' worth of dark stubble. His eyes, when he glanced sideways at her, were a deep, warm brown, the color of good saddle leather. He wore a worn but well-kept hat, the brim tilted just slightly from the habit of keeping the sun out of his eyes, and there was dried clay on the knees of his trousers that spoke plainly of a morning already started before most men had finished their coffee. He was Roscoe Sullivan. Clara had heard the name, the way you hear names in a small town without ever quite attaching them to a face. Sullivan Ranch, out past Juniper Ridge, cattle operation. Came through the drought 2 years back without losing too many head, kept to himself mostly. She had not, until this moment, had occasion to put a face to any of those facts. He looked at the closed bank door. He looked at the position of the sun. He looked at Clara, quietly and without any particular rudeness, the way a man looks at something that catches him genuinely off guard, and he hasn't yet decided what to make of it. "Bank doesn't open until 8, he said. "I am aware," Clara said, without looking at him. He nodded slowly, apparently satisfied with that, and settled his shoulder against the post at the edge of the overhang. He crossed one boot over the other at the ankle and appeared content to wait in companionable silence, which Clara appreciated more than any further conversation would have provided. They stood there, the two of them, with the town slowly waking up around them. A wagon rolled past. The smith's hammer began its rhythm from the far end of the street. The woman who ran the millinery shop appeared in her doorway to shake out a rug, glanced at the 2 people standing at the bank, and retreated back inside without comment. Clara was going over her speech in her head again, the parts about the record of consistent payments for 3 years before Daniel's accident, The part about the harvest she expected to bring in this fall on the south field if she could just hold the note until October. The part about the fact that this land was not merely property to her, but the place where she had buried her husband and was raising her daughter. When Roscoe Sullivan spoke again. "You planning on going in there and fighting for something?" he asked, not nosily, not unkindly. Just with the kind of plain, direct observation that comes from a man who has learned that the clearest path between 2 points is generally the one where you say what you actually mean. Clara turned and looked at him then, fully, for the first time. She studied his face for a moment, not the look of a woman being coy, but the look of a woman making an honest assessment of whether the person she was looking at deserved an honest answer. "I am," she said. He met her gaze, and held it without flinching or looking away the way some men did when she looked at them squarely. He just nodded once, with a kind of simple gravity, as though that was the most reasonable thing he had heard anyone say in some time. "Then I'll back whatever you're about to say," he said. Clara blinked. She had not expected that. She had not expected anything from this man, in fact. She had simply been enduring his proximity as she endured most things in her current life, with patient, contained fortitude. But those words, spoken so quietly and with such uncomplicated certainty, hit her somewhere beneath the sternum where the carefully organized armor of her grief and her worry had a small and private chink in it. She looked at him for another moment. "You don't even know what I'm about to say." "No," he agreed. "But I know what it looks like when someone's been standing in front of a door before it opens because they've got exactly one shot at something that matters. And I know what it looks like when that person deserves that shot." He paused. "So I'll back it." The bank door opened at 8 o'clock to the minute, swung wide by the teller's assistant, a young man named Tobias with ink-stained fingers who blinked at the two of them with mild surprise. Clara walked in first, her spine perfectly straight. Roscoe Sullivan walked in behind her. Gerald Ashworth's office was at the back of the bank, behind a low wooden railing and a gate that one was expected to wait at until invited through. He was a thick-necked man of about 50, with mutton-chop sideburns and the permanent expression of someone who has recently bitten into something sour and is managing the aftertaste. When he looked up from his desk and saw Clara Winslow walking through his door, his expression did not improve. "Mrs. Winslow," he said, the way a man says a name when he would prefer not to be saying it. "I believe we concluded our business last week." "We did not," Clara said, settling herself into the chair across from his desk with the kind of composure that took considerable internal effort to maintain. "You spoke. I listened. We did not conclude anything because I had not yet had the opportunity to present my full case." Ashworth's eyes moved briefly to the tall man who had come in with her and was now standing with his hat in his hands just inside the office doorway. His expression became slightly less dismissive and slightly more calculating. "Mr. Sullivan," he said, with the involuntary deference that men of commerce tend to show toward men they know to have assets of substance. "I wasn't aware you had an interest in the Winslow property." "I have an interest in fair dealing," Roscoe said pleasantly. He pulled the second chair in the office around to the side of the desk, spun it, and sat down on it backwards with his arms crossed over the back of it, which communicated a great deal about how comfortable he was in this room and how long he was planning on being there. "Please go ahead, Mrs. Winslow." Clara felt something shift slightly in the balance of the room. She did not know this man and she had not asked for his help, but there was something about having someone stand in your corner, someone who commanded a degree of involuntary respect in a town where she, as a widow, frequently found her own words landing with somewhat less weight than the situation deserved, that settled the last of the nerves in her stomach and let her think clearly. She presented her case. She laid out 18 months of figures, which she had written in a small leather notebook and had committed to memory as well, just in case. She explained the drought of 1876 and how it had pushed back their first delayed payment. She explained Daniel's accident in October of 1877, a fall from the barn roof that had not killed him immediately, but had done enough damage that he had spent 3 months unable to work, and had died in January of pneumonia, weakened as he was. She explained what she had managed alone since then: the mended fencing, the sold livestock she had kept back from the original herd, the smaller but steady income from the vegetable and grain sales to 2 of the local establishments. She explained the South Field and what she expected from it in October, and she backed that expectation with actual soil assessments she had asked the seed merchant to provide in writing, which she produced from her bag. She asked not for a forgiveness of the debt. She asked for an extension of 90 days and a restructured payment schedule that was specific and written down. When she finished, Gerald Ashworth looked at her with the expression of a man who had not expected to be impressed and was not prepared to admit that he somewhat was. He picked up the notebook she had passed across the desk and turned several pages without speaking. Roscoe Sullivan did not speak during any of this. He sat in his backwards chair and listened with complete attention, and Clara, who was watching Ashworth's face carefully, noticed in her peripheral vision that the banker kept glancing toward Roscoe as though taking some kind of private reading of the room. The bank's position on extensions of this type, Ashworth began, has been applied inconsistently, Roscoe said, without heat, without aggression, in the tone of a man simply supplying a fact. Tom Hendricks got 60 days extended last spring on the mill note. I happen to know that because Tom told me himself over a fence post. Ashworth set down the notebook. Those were different circumstances. They were, Roscoe agreed. Mrs. Winslow's circumstances appear to me to be considerably more documented and considerably better managed than Tom Hendricks's were. He tilted his head slightly. I'd be curious what the board would make of those documents if Mrs. Winslow chose to put them before it directly. The word board hung in the air of the office like a card placed face up on a table. Ashworth looked at Clara. He looked at her leather notebook. He looked at Roscoe Sullivan. He picked up his pen with the deliberate movements of a man making a decision he would be pretending was entirely his own idea. 90 days, he said, with the schedule as outlined. Miss Tobias will draft the modification before noon. He looked at Clara with the particular kind of neutrality that masked considerable displeasure. You'll want to review it carefully. I always do, Clara said. She stood, picked up her notebook and walked out of that office with her spine as straight as it had been when she came in, which was an achievement because her knees were not entirely steady. She made it through the low gate and to the front of the bank before she stopped, turned, and took one long, slow breath. Roscoe came through the gate a moment later, resettled his hat on his head, and pushed through the front door into the morning sunshine. He held the door for her as though it were the most natural thing in the world. Clara stepped out onto the boardwalk. The sun had come fully over the ridge now and was warm on her face, and she stood in it for a moment with her eyes closed and felt the loosening of something around her chest that had been cinched tight for the better part of a year. "Thank you," she said, when she opened her eyes. Roscoe was looking out at the street, at the wagon traffic and the rising dust, and he turned at the sound of her voice with a small, unhurried smile. It changed his face considerably, made it younger, warmer, like a lamp turned up from its overnight setting. "You did that yourself," he said. "I just took up space in a chair." "That is not an accurate account of what happened," Clara said. "Maybe not entirely," he allowed. He looked at her for a moment. "Roscoe Sullivan, my ranch is out past Juniper Ridge." "I know," she said, and held out her hand. "Clara Winslow." He shook it firmly, the way a man shakes a hand when he respects the person attached to it. "I know," he said. She looked at him for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, then pulled her hand back and tucked it into the fold of her other arm. "Well," she said, "good morning, Mr. Sullivan." "Good morning, Mrs. Winslow," he said. She walked to where her horse was tied at the rail down the block. He watched her go without making it conspicuous, which took some doing. Clara Winslow rode the 5 miles home with something that she had not carried on the ride into town, the small, tentative, slightly terrifying beginning of hope. The Winslow property, when seen from the ridge road that led down to it, was the kind of place that told you immediately what the people who worked it were made of. It was not grand, not like some of the spreads further north, but it was cared for with a thoroughness that spoke of real love for the land. The house was a solid one-story built of local stone with a covered porch along the front, white-painted trim that needed a fresh coat in one corner, a kitchen garden to the east side, and a small barn that was slightly too large for the one horse and two mules it currently housed, but had been built with ambition in mind. The south field, which Clara had spoken about in the bank, stretched wide and gold-brown in its late summer state, and it did indeed hold promise. Her daughter, Mattie, was 9 years old and had been left in the care of their neighbor Mrs. Elspeth Pryor for the morning. Mrs. Pryor was 70 years old, as wide as she was tall, and had opinions about everything that she communicated without hesitation to anyone within earshot. She was also one of the kindest women Clara had ever known, and she had a gift for keeping Mattie occupied that Clara was deeply grateful for. When Clara rode back up the lane, Mrs. Pryor was sitting on the porch with her knitting, and Mattie was in the yard attempting to teach one of the barn cats a trick that the cat was showing no interest in whatsoever. "Mama!" Mattie left the indifferent cat and ran to the fence in her bare feet. She had Clara's green eyes and Daniel's sandy hair and a gap between her two front teeth that she had been growing into for about 6 months. "Did it work? Did the man give you more time?" "He did," Clara said, swinging down from the saddle. Mattie let out a whoop of celebration that sent the cat off into the tall grass at considerable speed. Mrs. Pryor did not say anything immediately, but the knitting needles paused, and the old woman looked at Clara with the particular sharp-eyed attention that missed nothing. "Sit down," she said, when Mattie had taken the horse around to the water trough. "Tell me how it went." Clara sat on the porch step and told her. She included, after a slight hesitation, the part about Roscoe Sullivan standing behind her at the door and the part about him sitting in Ashworth's office. Mrs. Pryor listened without interrupting, which was unusual for her. When Clara finished, the old woman looked at her knitting for a long moment. "Roscoe Sullivan," she said, and her voice had a private quality to it that made Clara look up. "You know him?" Clara asked. "Everybody around here knows him or knows of him," Mrs. Pryor said. "His father built that ranch from practically nothing. Roscoe's run it alone for going on 7 years now since Frank Sullivan passed. He's a good man. Quiet, fair, not a troublemaker." She paused. "Also, he's 35 years old and not spoken for. And if you're thinking I didn't notice the way you said his name just now, I want you to know I've been alive long enough that nothing gets past me." "I said his name exactly the same way I say every other name," Clara said, with a composure she was aware was not entirely persuasive. Said Mrs. Pryor, and picked her knitting back up. Over the following 2 weeks, Clara threw herself into the work of the farm with the renewed energy of a woman who has just been given a reprieve and intends to make full and furious use of it. She hired 2 day laborers from town to help get the south field prepared for the final harvest push, negotiated a better price from the grain merchant, mended the north fence line herself with Mattie handing her tools and asking questions about everything, and generally kept herself so occupied from before sunrise to after sunset that she did not have occasion to think about Roscoe Sullivan more than she estimated 4 or 5 times a day, which she considered to be perfectly reasonable. On the 3rd Saturday after the bank meeting, she was in the kitchen garden with her sleeves rolled to the elbows and dirt up to her wrists when she heard a horse coming up the lane and looked up to see a big roan gelding with Roscoe Sullivan on its back. She had approximately 4 seconds to wish she did not look like she had been wrestling with a root vegetable, which she had, before he pulled up at the garden gate and touched his hat brim. "Mrs. Winslow," he said. "Mr. Sullivan," she said, straightening up and doing her best to look like she had not just been startled. "This is unexpected." "I hope not too unexpected," he said, swinging down from the roan with the easy, practiced movement of a man who has been getting on and off horses his whole life. "I was out this way checking the fence line on the juniper parcel. Thought I'd stop and see how things were getting on. The juniper parcel, Clara was fairly certain, was not in the direction of Coldwater Creek, which was the direction he would have come from. This was not the kind of observation she was going to make out loud. "Things are getting on well," she said. She looked at her muddy hands and then at the general state of herself and decided there was nothing to be done about it. "The South field's looking better than I hoped. The grain merchant agreed to a fair price for the October yield." "That's good news," he said, and he said it with the quality of a man who was genuinely pleased to hear it, not simply filling air. He was leaning on the top rail of the garden fence now, not inside it, the hat pushed back slightly on his head, the late afternoon light doing something warm and uncomplicated to the angles of his face. "Would you like some water?" Clara asked. "Or coffee?" "I was about to put a pot on." "Coffee would be much appreciated," he said, and she heard in his voice something that was trying not to be too eager about it, which she found, against all the reasonable advice she had been giving herself for 3 weeks, quite charming. They sat on the porch with their coffee while Mattie, who had appeared from the direction of the barn, the moment a stranger's horse came up the lane, conducted what amounted to a comprehensive interview of Roscoe Sullivan from the porch step. She asked him how many horses he had, what their names were, whether any of them could do tricks, whether he had ever been in a real fight, whether he thought cats were smarter than dogs or the other way around, and whether he preferred peaches or apples, the last question being one she apparently asked everyone as a kind of litmus test. Roscoe answered all of these questions with complete seriousness and good humor, and without once talking down to her the way some adults did, which Clara noticed and filed away. "Apples," he told Mattie on the final question, "though it depends considerably on the pie." Mattie pointed at him with a 9-year-old's absolute authority. "Correct answer." Clara caught his eye over Mattie's head and found him already looking at her with the warm, amused expression of a man who was thoroughly delighted by the situation he found himself in. She looked back at her coffee cup before the smile on her own face got out of hand. He stayed for an hour. He helped Clara carry in the last of the garden harvest before he left, simply picking up the crates without asking as though it were obvious. He paused at the gate on the way out, holding the roan's reins, and looked back at the house in the evening light. "It's a fine place," he said, and he meant it. That was obvious. "Daniel Winslow built something real here." "He did," Clara said, and there was grief in her voice but also pride, the two things she most often felt together when she thought of Daniel, who had been a good man, a solid man, who had loved her and Mattie and this piece of land with a steady faithfulness that she had counted on and still missed the shape of, even as the sharpest edge of the grief had gentled somewhat into something she could carry without it stopping her breath every time. Roscoe looked at her with the quiet perception she was beginning to associate with him specifically. "He did well," he said, "and so are you." She held that sentence for a long time after he rode away. He came back the following Saturday, and the one after that. On the third Saturday, he did not pretend to have been passing by on the way to anywhere. He simply rode up the lane in the mid-morning with a jar of his cook's preserved plums tied to the saddle horn and said, "I thought I'd see if there was anything needed doing today," which was the most effective sentence he had yet managed in terms of its impact on Clara's carefully maintained composure. There was, as it happened, a great deal that needed doing. The barn roof had 2 boards that needed replacing before the fall rains came, the water pump handle needed a new bolt, and one of the fence posts along the east side had rotted at the base and needed pulling and resetting. Clara had been managing these things as time allowed, which meant they had been on a list that was getting longer faster than she was getting through it. Roscoe showed up to that list the way he seemed to show up to most things, without drama, with full application of himself, and with a kind of cheerful competence that made it apparent he had been doing this kind of work his whole life. They worked most of the day. Mattie helped and chatted the whole time and periodically brought water from the pump, which she considered a very important job. By mid-afternoon, both bad fence posts were reset, the pump handle was fixed, and Roscoe was halfway through the barn roof with Clara handing up boards from below. "How do you manage all this alone?" he asked, not accusingly, not with pity, just with the genuine curiosity of a man who wanted to understand. "One thing at a time," Clara said. "Same way anyone manages anything, I expect." "Not everyone," he said. "Not without help." There was a pause in which he fitted a board and hammered it down. "I mean that as a real observation, not a criticism." "I know," she said. She did know. There was something in the way he said things that made it consistently clear what he meant by them, and she had stopped having to interpret his words for ulterior motives about 2 Saturdays ago. "I had more help when Daniel was alive. Mrs. Pryor comes when she can, and Mattie's more useful than most people give her credit for." "From what I've observed, Mattie could run a small municipality," Roscoe said, with such complete conviction that Clara laughed, a real, unguarded laugh that came out before she could think about it, and hung in the barn air like something that had been let out of a locked room. Roscoe looked down through the half-repaired roof at her, and the expression on his face was one she had not seen before, something warm and startled and careful all at once. The look of a man who has just seen something he did not expect and is not sure yet what to do with it except hold very still. He came back down the ladder shortly after, and they sat on the tailgate of the wagon to eat the lunch Clara had packed, while Mattie ate quickly and went back to whatever mission with the barn cat she had been pursuing since morning. The afternoon stretched easy and warm around them. "Your ranch," Clara said. "How many head are you running this year?" 300 and some, he said. "Lost some in the last dry spell but built it back up better. I've got 3 hands, good ones, been with me long enough that I trust them the way you trust people you've been through something real with." He tore off a piece of bread and looked at it. "It gets lonely, though. The ranch house is big. My father built it for a family, and it's been just me in it for going on 7 years." He said it simply, without fishing for anything, and Clara respected that. She looked at the homestead around her, the kitchen garden, the stone house, the barn with its fresh boards on the roof, and thought about loneliness. She thought about what it was to have had a person beside you and then not have them, and about the particular strangeness of a house that was once too full of someone and was now too quiet. "I understand that," she said. He looked at her sideways in the slow afternoon light. "I expect you do." There was a long, easy silence, the kind that only happens between people who have stopped being strangers. "I'm going to be honest with you about something," Clara said, because she had never known how to be otherwise, and because the alternative, the coy and indirect approach that some women employed in these situations, felt like wearing clothes that did not fit her. "I have been thinking about you a good deal since the day at the bank, more than I was prepared for, given that I don't have a great deal of spare capacity for thinking about things that are not the farm or Mattie." Roscoe was very still for a moment. Then he set his bread down with the careful deliberation of a man making sure he did not drop things. "I have been thinking about you a good deal as well," he said. "More than I have thought about much of anything in a very long time." He paused. "I wanted to say something direct, but I wasn't sure how you'd receive it, and I didn't want to. I didn't want to say the wrong thing to a person who's been through what you've been through." "I appreciate that," Clara said, "but I'm not fragile, Mr. Sullivan. I'm tired and I'm in debt and I've got muddy hands about 90% of the time, but I am not fragile." "No," he said with the quality of a man who has been paying close attention. "You're not." He turned toward her slightly. "I'd like to court you if that's something you'd be willing to consider, properly. No rush. Just honestly, and with full knowledge that I'm not only interested in this because it's convenient or because you need someone, but because you are genuinely one of the most remarkable people I have ever had the pleasure of meeting." Clara looked at him. 32 years old, 14 months a widow, 40 acres of hope and debt and love on her shoulders, and this tall, quiet, steady man looking at her like she was something worth looking at. "I'd be willing to consider it," she said. The smile that appeared on Roscoe Sullivan's face was the kind that looked like it hadn't been fully deployed in a good while and was therefore somewhat unpracticed but entirely sincere. "Good," he said. "That's very good." October came in golden and cooperative, and the Southfield harvest was everything Clara had projected to the grain merchant, and then some. She spent 2 solid weeks of long days bringing it in, with the day laborers and with Roscoe, who arrived on the first day of harvest as though there had never been any question of where he would be, rolled up his sleeves beside the rest of them, and did not leave until the last load was in the barn. He brought his hand Jake with him on 2 of those days, a quiet, rangy young man of about 20 who worked without complaint, and whom Mattie interrogated with the same systematic thoroughness she had applied to Roscoe, to his visible amusement. On the evening of the last harvest day, when the barn was full and the light was going golden pink over the ridge and Mattie was asleep in the house already, exhausted from a day of what she called helping, Clara stood at the edge of the south field and felt the full weight of what had been accomplished settle through her. She heard Roscoe come up beside her. He was close but not too close, in the way he always positioned himself, present but not presuming. "You did it," he said. "We did it," she said. "No," he said quietly. "This field is yours. This harvest is yours. I handed some things and drove some loads. The plan was yours, the ground is yours, the work was yours. That belongs to you, Clara." It was the first time he had used her given name. It was not accidental. She turned to look at him in the evening light, and whatever she had been carefully managing inside herself for the last 8 weeks became, in that moment, somewhat less manageable. He was looking at her with an expression that was honest all the way through, no performance, no strategy, just a man who felt something and was not trying to hide that he did. She reached out and took his hand. His fingers folded around hers and held on. They stood like that for a while, watching the light fade from the south field, and it was one of the best moments Clara Winslow had experienced in over a year. A week later, she paid Gerald Ashworth 2 payments against the note from the harvest proceeds, a sum large enough that his permanent sour expression thinned somewhat when he looked at the amount. She walked out of the bank into the sunshine and stood on the same boardwalk where she had stood before the doors opened that September morning, and she thought about how different the air tasted now. The courtship proper and unhurried as Roscoe had promised, it would be unfolded through the fall and into the winter, with the kind of ease that Clara had not expected and deeply appreciated. He came on Saturdays and sometimes Wednesday evenings, and he brought small things with him each time. A jar of something his cook had put up, a length of good rope because she had mentioned hers was wearing thin, once a book of poetry that he handed over slightly sheepishly, and said he had been told it was a good one by a woman at the bookshop, and he had no opinion on poetry himself but thought she might. She read 3 of the poems to Mattie at bedtime that night and found them excellent. He took her to supper at the hotel dining room in Coldwater Creek on the 2nd Saturday of November, which was the nicest establishment in town, and required Clara to put on the second-best dress she owned, which was not the black one. It was a deep russet color, and she had almost not kept it after Daniel died because it felt too cheerful for a widow, but she had kept it, and now she was grateful. Roscoe opened every door and pulled out her chair and sat across from her at the white cloth table with the look of a man who was genuinely happy to be exactly where he was. And Clara thought that whoever had told her that second chances were not real had been wrong. Over supper, she told him about Daniel, really told him, not the general polite outline but the actual person. The way Daniel had been funny and sometimes stubborn and very good at building things and not so good at asking for help. The way he had danced badly but with great enthusiasm. The way he had looked at Mattie from the day she was born with a kind of pure, disbelieving wonder that Clara had thought was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen on a grown man's face. Roscoe listened to all of it. He did not look uncomfortable or try to redirect. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment and then he said, "He sounds like he was a real man, the kind worth knowing. He was, Clara said, and for the first time she said it without the tightness behind it. She said it with the clean, kept quality of a memory that had been honored and could now be held without the weight of fresh loss. "I'm sorry you lost him," Roscoe said, "and I hope that saying 'I'm glad I know you' doesn't come out wrong." "It doesn't," Clara said. After supper, he walked her to where her horse was tied, and he stood in the cold November night under a sky so full of stars it seemed excessive, and he held both her hands in his and looked at her. "I would very much like to kiss you," he said, with the directness that she had come to expect and to treasure. "But only if you'd like that too." "I would like that too," she said. He kissed her gently, briefly, in the cold outside the hotel. His hands stayed where they were, holding hers. It was not an elaborate kiss. It was the kind of kiss that is entirely about meaning what it means, and it meant a great deal. When he pulled back, his expression was the most unguarded she had ever seen it, and she thought that Roscoe Sullivan, who was capable and quiet and steady and kept most things close, must not have kissed anyone in a very long time and had felt the full weight of it. "Good night, Clara," he said. "Good night, Roscoe," she said, and rode home in the cold with warmth all through her. November deepened. The days grew short and the nights bit hard, and the rhythm of the Winslow place shifted to its winter pace, feeding the animals, checking the root cellar stores, keeping the wood supply up, keeping the stove running. Maddie had her lessons to attend to in the mornings. Clara taught her herself from a set of primers she had ordered from a catalog, and in the afternoons she was in general an unstoppable force of energy and inquiry that kept Clara perpetually on her toes. On the third Sunday of November, Roscoe arrived in the afternoon and stayed for supper, which had been happening with increasing regularity. Clara made a pot roast with the last of the fall root vegetables and some preserved tomatoes from the kitchen garden, and they ate at the small square table in the kitchen by lamplight, while Maddie told an extremely detailed story about a dispute between two of the barn cats that had apparently been ongoing for several weeks. After Maddie was in bed, Clara and Roscoe sat by the fire with their coffee, and the quiet that fell between them was the particular, deep variety that you only share with someone once you have become genuinely familiar with each other. The kind of silence that is not empty but full, that does not require filling. He looked over at her after a while, and she was watching the fire, and he studied her profile in the firelight with an expression that he did not bother to conceal. "What are you thinking?" she asked, not looking away from the fire. "That I've been thinking about you since the first moment you turned around and looked at me with those green eyes on that bank boardwalk," he said, "and that I haven't once stopped since." Clara looked at him then. The firelight was doing something warm and particular to his face, and his eyes were entirely serious. "I love you," he said. "I mean that as plainly and straightforwardly as I know how to say anything. I have not said that to anyone in many years, and I would not say it now if I did not mean it fully." Clara felt the words land in her chest and take root there, in the same place where the small chink in her armor had been since the day on the bank boardwalk. She felt the full scope of what this man had become to her in these months, not a replacement, not a solution to her practical problems, but a person, an actual person who had chosen her and stayed and showed up and told the truth and looked at Maddie like she was exactly as wonderful as she was. "I love you," she said. "I was not expecting to, this soon after losing Daniel. But there it is, and I would rather say it honestly than manage it carefully." He crossed the distance between their chairs and sat beside her on the edge of hers, and she shifted to make room, and he put his arm around her, and she leaned into his shoulder, and they stayed like that by the fire for a long time, and it felt like something coming right, like a door set straight in its frame after a long time hung off-kilter. December arrived, and with it a problem that Clara had not fully anticipated. The banknote modification that Ashworth had signed was for 90 days, which meant it came due again in mid-December. The harvest proceeds had covered 2 payments and reduced the principal significantly, But there was still a remaining balance that Clara had planned to cover through the winter with the livestock sales she had scheduled for the spring, and the rent she was collecting from a small outbuilding she had let to a local man who stored equipment in it. She had the numbers laid out, and they were manageable tight, but manageable. What she had not accounted for was that 3 of her 4 breeding ewes animals she had been very careful about keeping, and that represented a meaningful part of her spring income calculation, got into a neighbor's grain stores through a broken fence section in the dark of a November night, and ate themselves sick. The neighbor, a man named Carver who was unfailingly unpleasant to everyone he encountered, presented Clara with a bill for the grain damage that was punishing, and she believed, exaggerated, but which she could not easily dispute without the kind of legal fight that would cost more than the bill. She paid it. It left her December numbers looking very different from what she had planned. She did not tell Roscoe immediately. She spent 3 days running her ledger figures forward and backward looking for the combination that worked, and it was not coming together in a way that felt secure. And on the 4th day, she sat down at the kitchen table with Maddie at school. She had arranged for Maddie to attend the town school 2 days a week, which the teacher, a Miss Hargrove, had been very willing to accommodate, and she put her face in her hands. She was not a person who cried easily. She had cried the day Daniel died, and she had cried quietly in the dark several nights in that first terrible winter, and she had not permitted herself to cry much since, because there was always something that needed doing and crying did not do it. But she was very tired and she was frightened, and the thin, honest truth of it was that she did not want to have fought this hard and come this far and still lose her home. When Roscoe came by that evening, he knew immediately that something was wrong. He had a particular attentiveness to her that she had become accustomed to, the way he read the quality of the air around her with a precision that she sometimes found unnerving because it meant she could not be vague with him even when she wanted to be. "What's happened?" he said at the door. She told him. All of it, the ewes, the bill, the ledger, the December numbers, what it meant for the note. She told it clean and straight, the same way she told everything, without self-pity and without minimizing. When she finished, he sat across from her at the kitchen table and looked at the figures she had laid out and was quiet for a moment. "Let me loan you the difference," he said. "No," Clara said immediately. He looked up from the figures. "Clara," I said no, she said. "I'm not saying that out of pride. I'm saying it because I know what it means to owe a person. I owe a bank, and that is a transaction between a borrower and an institution. If I owe you, that is a different thing, and I will not have it between us. Not when things are as they are between us." He was quiet for a moment, absorbing that. "You're worried it would change things," he said. "I'm worried it would change everything," she said. "And what we have is the most intact and honest thing I've been part of in a long time, and I won't put it at risk." He looked at her for a long moment, and she could see him turning this over, and she could also see that he understood, because understanding things without needing them explained twice was another of his qualities that she had catalogued with considerable care. "All right," he said. "Not alone." He picked up the ledger sheet and studied it again. "But let me think about this from a different angle." What he came up with, after some thought and a quiet conversation with Clara about what assets and arrangements she was not currently utilizing, was the following. He owned grazing rights to a parcel adjacent to the Winslow property that he was not currently using because it was not needed for his own herd. If Clara were to run a small number of his cattle on that parcel through the winter grazing they already had access to through the arrangement, he would pay her a grazing fee, which was a standard commercial arrangement between ranchers. Not a gift, not a loan. A business arrangement between 2 people who had assets the other could use. The grazing fee came to almost exactly the gap in her December figures. Clara looked at the numbers for a long time. She looked at him. "Those grazing rights really aren't being used." "I can show you the parcel map," he said, "and you can ask Jake or either of the other hands. They'll tell you the same thing." She believed him. She also noticed, and filed away as a separate matter, that the amount he had calculated for the grazing fee happened to be almost perfectly calibrated to the amount she needed, which was a precision that might have been coincidental and might not have been, and which she decided she did not need to examine too closely tonight. "All right," she said. "A business arrangement." He nodded, and the way he did it with that small, quiet satisfaction that he had when something good happened was something she had come to find very dear. They had it written up properly before the week was out, witnessed by Mrs. Pryor, who stamped it with her own seal from her previous life as a court clerk in Kansas and said, while pressing the stamp down, "You two are the most complicated, simple people I have ever met," which neither of them disputed. The December payment went to Gerald Ashworth on time. His expression when Clara placed the payment on his desk was one she decided to simply enjoy without comment. Christmas came quietly and warmly to the Winslow homestead. Roscoe spent Christmas Day with them, having had his own cook and the 3 ranch hands to the main house for a Christmas dinner the day before, and arriving at the Winslow place in the mid-morning with his roan and a pack horse carrying several wrapped parcels with the slightly self-conscious air of a man who does not often wrap things, and has done his best with limited natural aptitude. There was a new set of primers for Mattie, significantly better than the ones Clara had been using, along with a set of colored pencils that Mattie received with a reverence ordinarily reserved for sacred objects. There was a length of good green wool for Clara, the color of her eyes, which she noted and did not comment on, just held his gaze for a moment with a warmth that said what she chose not to say out loud in front of Mattie. There was a small practical thing for the kitchen, and a large impractical thing for the porch, a rocking chair, which he had commissioned from the woodworker in town, because the porch currently only had one, and he had been sitting on a crate on the last several visits. "That is extremely forward planning," Clara told him. "I'm a practical man," he said, with a small private smile. Clara had made him a winter coat from a pattern she had adapted from one she found in a women's magazine, using a heavy canvas for the outer layer, and a wool lining she had pieced together from several remnants, all in earth tones that would suit him. She had been working on it for 6 weeks in the evenings after Mattie was in bed, and she had lost sleep over it on several occasions because the shoulders were complicated, but she had gotten them right. He held it for a long moment after she gave it to him, running his hands over the stitching. "Clara," he said quietly in the voice he used when something mattered. "Try it on," she said. He did. It fit, which was a considerable relief. He stood in the middle of the Winslow kitchen on Christmas morning in a coat she had made him, and he looked at her with something in his face that was past words. "It's the finest coat I've ever owned," he said. Mattie, who had been watching this exchange with the alert, missing-nothing attention she brought to anything she considered important, said, "Mama was up very late on lots of nights making that." "Mattie," Clara said. "You were," Mattie said, unrepentantly, and went back to her colored pencils. Roscoe looked at Clara. She looked back at him. He crossed the kitchen and kissed her forehead with a care and tenderness that made her close her eyes briefly. "Merry Christmas, Clara," he said. "Merry Christmas, Roscoe," she said. January was cold and uneventful and comfortable in a way that Clara had not associated with January for a very long time. February came, and with it the beginning of the planting season, the seed orders, the planting schedules, the calculations for the spring. Roscoe helped with the planning, not by taking over but by sitting across the table from her, with the maps spread out, and his own experience with the land, and the seasons available for her to use or not as she chose. And there was a collaborative quality to those evenings that felt like practicing something they would do for a very long time. In early March, Roscoe took Clara to see his ranch. She had not been there before. She had imagined it various ways based on the things he had said and the things she knew, but the actual place was something else. The Sullivan Ranch sat in a wide, well-watered valley on the west side of Juniper Ridge, and it was genuinely substantial, the main house large and well-built in the Spanish style with thick walls and a tiled roof, and a deep covered veranda that wrapped around 2 sides. There were proper outbuildings, a bunkhouse, a large barn, 3 paddocks, and about as far as the eye could follow, land that was managed with the same thoroughness that Clara had come to associate with Roscoe himself. He showed her through the house with the slightly careful quality of a man showing someone something he is proud of, and is also a little anxious about how it will be received. The main room was large and well-furnished in the spare, practical style of a man living alone, good pieces, well-made, but nothing unnecessary. The kitchen was bigger than hers by some margin. There were 3 bedrooms upstairs and 2 downstairs and hallways, and a study where the desk was covered in papers in the organized chaos of a working rancher. Clara stood in the main room and looked around her and felt the size of the life that was lived here, and the quietness at the center of it, the particular quiet of a house that has been too large for one person for too long. He stood in the doorway watching her take it in. "It needs a family," he said. He said it plainly, in the same register he said most important things. "I've known that for a while. I didn't know how to go about finding one, or maybe I was waiting without being quite clear on what I was waiting for." He paused. "And then you were standing in front of a bank door before it opened." Clara turned and looked at him. He was standing there in the doorway of his enormous, well-made, slightly too quiet house in the coat she had made him, and she thought about all the things she had been afraid of since Daniel died, losing the land, failing Maddie, being truly alone, never again having someone who knew her, and she thought about how all of those fears had been changing their shape slowly and quietly since a September morning on a boardwalk. "Roscoe Sullivan," she said, "are you asking me to marry you?" "I'm building up to it," he said. "I wanted to show you this first. Because I'm not asking you to leave your home and come here. I'm asking if this could also be a home to you. That's a different question." She looked around the room again. The thick walls, the deep veranda, the wide valley outside the window, and beyond the window her own ridgeline visible in the distance, the juniper ridge that she had always seen from her kitchen window and that had always meant the boundary of her world. And here was the other side of it. "Come here," she said. He crossed the room and stopped in front of her. She looked up at him. He was several inches taller than her, and she was used to that now, used to the particular quality of his presence, the steadiness of it. "Ask me properly," she said. He took her hands. "Clara Winslow," he said, "I am asking you to marry me, to let me be a husband to you and a stepfather to Maddie, to the extent she'll allow it, knowing that she will likely run things regardless. I am asking you because I love you, and because my life has been considerably more whole since you came into it, and I have no interest in going back to the way it was before." He paused. "I would also like to note that the answer you give will entirely determine whether the next several decades of my life are good or significantly worse, so no pressure." She laughed at that, which was apparently exactly what he had been aiming for, because he smiled with his whole face. "Yes," she said. "Roscoe, yes." He pulled her in and held her, and she held him back, and outside the wide window of the Sullivan Ranch house the juniper ridge line sat golden and patient and enormous under the March sky. They told Maddie that evening, back at the Winslow homestead. Clara had thought about how to say it, but Roscoe had suggested simply telling her the plain truth, which she agreed with, and so they sat Maddie down after supper and told her. Maddie was 9 years old. She had her mother's green eyes and her father's sandy hair, and a gap between her front teeth, and a comprehensive and extremely confident set of opinions about everything, and she sat very still for about 15 seconds after they told her, which was unusually still for Maddie, and then she looked at Roscoe. "You are going to be my stepfather," she said. "That's what I'm hoping for," Roscoe said, "and we would live at your ranch. You and your mother would have your home here in the ranch." "Both," he said. "You would not have to give up anything that's yours." Maddie considered this at length. "Your roan horse," she said. "What's his name?" "Bourbon," said Roscoe. "Can I ride Bourbon?" "When I'm with you, and when you're big enough that your feet reach the stirrups." Maddie looked at him for one more long, assessing moment, and then said, "All right," in the tone of a chief executive approving a proposal that had met all her requirements, and slid off her chair and went to get her colored pencils. Clara looked at Roscoe. Roscoe looked at Clara. He put his hand over his mouth briefly, and she could see the shape of a very large, entirely contained smile behind it. The wedding was set for April, on a Saturday that the almanac suggested would be clear, and it was. They were married in the small Presbyterian church at the end of Coldwater Creek's Main Street by Reverend Cahill, who was a brisk, kind man who had been marrying and burying the people of this town for 20 years and had developed an excellent sense for which of his weddings were going to last. He looked at Clara and Roscoe standing together at the front of the church, her in the russet dress with a wreath of early spring wildflowers in her hair, him in his good suit, and the coat she had made him, both of them looking at each other with the entirely unmanaged, entirely honest expression of people who are not performing anything, but simply arriving at a place they have been working toward for some time. And he thought, with quiet satisfaction, that this was one of the lasting ones. Mrs. Pryor sat in the front pew and cried, which she did not attempt to conceal, and which she later referred to as a dust situation when asked about it. Mattie stood beside her mother as a witness, wearing a new dress in a blue that made her eyes look very green, holding the rings with the focused gravity of someone in possession of extremely important objects, which she was. Roscoe's 3 ranch hands were there, Jake and the other 2, who were named Cole and Domingo. Domingo, who was a man of 40-something with a completely illegible face under ordinary circumstances, was openly smiling by the end of the ceremony, which Jake later said he had never seen before and probably would not see again. After the ceremony, there was a gathering at the hotel dining room, the whole of it hired out for the afternoon with food that Clara and Mrs. Pryor had been preparing for 3 days, and a fiddle player who kept going as long as anyone wanted to dance, which was a very long time. Roscoe danced, as it turned out, with a solid and somewhat methodical earnestness that was very different from Daniel's enthusiastic chaos and entirely characteristic of who he was. And Clara danced with him and thought that you could love people in different ways, and that having loved once did not diminish the capacity to love again, but rather, in some ways she had not expected, deepened it. Mattie danced with everyone, including Jake, who was visibly both honored and terrified by the assignment, and eventually fell asleep in one of the chairs against the wall with a piece of wedding cake still in her hand, which was perhaps the most accurate representation of her character Clara had ever witnessed. They moved between the 2 properties through the spring and summer, the way they had negotiated. The Winslow homestead maintained and worked, its note paid down steadily from the combined income of the ranch and the farm, and the Sullivan ranch the primary home. Clara had kept her ledger and her methods and brought them to the ranch's accounts, which Roscoe had been managing adequately but without the particular systematic clarity that was one of her genuine gifts. And within a month she had reorganized them in a way that showed both of them several places where efficiency could be improved, which Roscoe received with the combination of admiration and slightly rueful amusement of a man who has been doing something a certain way for a long time and is being shown that another way is better. Mattie started at the town school full-time in September, which Miss Hargrove was very pleased about, and which Mattie regarded with the combination of genuine excitement about learning and significant opinions about the organizational methods of the curriculum. Miss Hargrove, who was a sensible woman, put these opinions to good use by making Mattie the unofficial keeper of the classroom library, which turned out to be an inspired solution. Through the summer and into the fall, a contentment settled over Clara that she recognized, but had not felt in the full, uncomplicated way she felt it now for a very long time. It was not the absence of difficulty. There were still hard days, still long hours, still the work that was always the work on land like this. It was the presence of something, the presence of partnership, of a person who was genuinely and consistently beside her, not just in the practical logistics of the farm and the ranch, but in all the small and continuous ways that constituted a shared life. Roscoe, she came to know through these months, was a man who had kept a great deal inside himself for a long time, not out of deception, but out of a kind of habitual self-containment that had developed from years of managing everything alone. Living with Clara, which required a degree of honesty and directness that he had not practiced as a consistent daily habit since his parents were alive, was apparently both somewhat challenging for him and extremely good for him, and she watched him unfold gradually over those months into something that was warmer and more present and more frequently in the possession of that large, sincere, unpracticed smile. She loved him more every month. It was not the dizzying quality of very young love, which she had felt once, long ago, before real life had given it the full weight and complexity that time brings. It was something more durable and perhaps more valuable, the kind of love that knows who it's for, and why, and means to last. In November, Clara became aware that she was expecting a child. She told Roscoe on a Tuesday evening after supper, sitting at the kitchen table of the ranch house. She had been measuring her own certainty about it for 2 weeks, not wanting to say anything until she was sure, and now she was sure. He went very still the way he went still when something significant landed. He looked at her. Then he pushed back from his chair and came around to her side of the table and crouched down beside her chair and took her face in his hands with a care so complete and specific that it was very nearly too much to hold. "Are you all right?" he said. "Are you well?" "I'm very well," she said, "and very happy." He stayed there for a moment, his hands cupping her face, looking at her with an expression that was unreadable in the sense that it contained too many things at once to name any one of them. Then he kissed her forehead and her cheek and then her hands. "Clara," he said, and he said her name the way you say a word that means more than it can carry. "I know," she said. They told Maddie that same evening. Maddie received the news with a thoughtful expression, processed it for about 45 seconds, and then said, "I want a brother." "That's not quite how it's determined," Clara said. "I want a brother who I can teach things to," Maddie specified, as though clarifying might improve her odds. "Noted," said Roscoe. The note on the Winslow homestead was paid in full in January of the following year, 1880, which fell on a Thursday morning, and Clara and Roscoe went together to the bank to deliver the final payment. Gerald Ashworth received them in his office with the expression of a man eating something sour who has had long practice in the management of the aftertaste. He stamped the note paid, signed the release, and pushed it across the desk. Clara picked it up. She held it for a moment and looked at it, the bank seal, Ashworth's signature, the words "paid in full" stamped in red across the face of the document that had defined so much of her fear and her determination for the last year and a half. She had been standing in front of these bank doors before they opened with everything she had riding on what she was about to say, and she had said it, and she had been backed up, and she had fought for this piece of ground and kept it and made it work, and now it was hers, truly and completely hers. She folded the document and put it in her bag. She looked at Gerald Ashworth. "Thank you for your time," she said, in a tone of perfect professional courtesy. He nodded, not quite meeting her eyes. She stood, and Roscoe stood beside her, and they walked out of the bank into the January morning. Clara stopped on the boardwalk, the same spot where everything had begun, and tilted her face up to the cold, clean winter sky. Roscoe came to stand beside her. He slid his hand into hers. "How does it feel?" he said. "Like standing on solid ground," she said. He squeezed her hand, and she leaned briefly into his shoulder. And there on the boardwalk in front of the First Territorial Bank of Coldwater Creek on a January morning in 1880, with the town moving around them and the sky enormous and blue overhead, Clara Winslow Sullivan allowed herself the full, uncomplicated experience of having one. The baby came in July, on a hot and breathless afternoon that lasted entirely too long, and then resolved itself in the sudden, enormous, unmistakable way that all such afternoons eventually do. The doctor from town had been sent for and arrived in time, and Mrs. Pryor was there, and Maddie was kept in the kitchen by Domingo, who had apparently been selected for this duty on the basis that he was the most unflappable of the three ranch hands, a quality now receiving its most rigorous test. Roscoe stayed close. He was not the kind of man who paced. He was far too contained for that, but he was in the hallway in a state of very still, very intense attention that Mrs. Pryor told him several times was not helping anyone, to which he said nothing because there was nothing to say. When the doctor came out of the room and said everything had gone well and that his wife was asking for him, Roscoe went in and found Clara pale and exhausted and entirely magnificent in the bed, holding a bundle of approximately 8 pounds that was making an absolute insistence on being noticed. He sat on the edge of the bed. Clara held the bundle out to him. He took it with the careful, somewhat unsteady hands of a man holding a baby for the first time in his life, and looked down into the face of his son. "Hello," he said very quietly to the tiny scrunched face regarding him from the blanket. "I'm your father." The baby made a sound of what appeared to be consideration. "What do you think?" Clara said, watching him. Roscoe looked at her. His face had done the thing it did when it held too many things at once to name, but this time it was entirely clear what they were. "I think he looks like you," he said. "He has your chin," she said. They named him James Daniel Sullivan, James for Roscoe's father, Daniel for the man whose land had grown into a home worth fighting for, and whose daughter still sometimes talked to the sky on particularly good afternoons, in the way of a child who keeps her own counsel about what she believes. Maddie met her brother that evening, when she was allowed into the room at last. She stood over the cradle that Roscoe had built himself over the previous weeks from a pattern he had found in a furniture book, and she looked at James Daniel Sullivan for a long, serious time. "He's very small," she said. "He'll get bigger," said Roscoe. "He doesn't look like he can learn much yet," Maddie observed. "Give him a few months," Clara said. "I will be very patient," Maddie said, in the tone of a person announcing a significant personal commitment, and kissed her brother very carefully on the top of his head. The years that followed were the good years, the kind that you understand the value of while they are happening, which is the best way to have them. The ranch grew, and the farm thrived, managed together with the combined and complementary intelligence of two people who each brought different things to the equation, and had learned to trust each other's assessments. Roscoe expanded the herd, and Clara expanded the kitchen garden into a proper market garden that supplied 3 establishments in Coldwater Creek and 1 in the larger town of Mesilla, 20 miles south. The Winslow homestead, now officially in the ranch's holdings and free of debt, became a second working property with its own small operation. Maddie grew up into a young woman of formidable capability and independence, which surprised no one who had been paying attention for the previous 10 years. She was 17 in 1886, and by that age she could manage the ranch accounts, ride as well as any of the hands, speak 2 languages because she had decided at 13 that she wanted to, and had very clear opinions about everything from crop rotation to the best way to train a working dog. She was preparing to attend the normal school in Santa Fe in the fall to study education, because she wanted to teach, which Miss Hargrove had said upon hearing it was the most inevitable development she had encountered in 30 years of teaching. James was 6 in 1886 and was a brown-haired, brown-eyed force of limitless energy, who had never once sat still for longer than it took to eat breakfast, and who had been caught on 3 separate occasions, attempting to teach Bourbon the roan horse to come when called, which Bourbon was refusing to do on grounds of principle. He was very like Roscoe in the best ways and somewhat like Clara in the ways that made Roscoe look at her with expression of pure, private amusement. The directness, the absolute confidence in his own assessment of a situation, and the tendency to state uncomfortable truths without warning. There was another child, too, a girl named Frances, born in 1883, who was 3 in 1886 and had Clara's green eyes and a disposition so serene and good-natured that Mrs. Pryor called her the most cooperative person she had ever met, and she included several decades' worth of adults in that assessment. Frances mostly sat near, wherever Clara was working, and handed things to people, and patted the cats with the patient, thorough gentleness of a very small person who understood intuitively that gentleness was the appropriate approach. On the evening of Maddie's 17th birthday, they sat on the wide veranda of the Sullivan Ranch house, all of them, in the warm September evening, Clara and Roscoe in the 2 rocking chairs that had been added to with each of the children as they grew old enough to sit in one, Maddie and James and Frances in various configurations, with a birthday cake on the table between them that was slightly lopsided because James had helped make it and had been very insistent about the frosting. The valley was gold and purple in the late light. The horses were quiet in the paddock. The smells of the evening sage and grass and wood smoke from the cook stove, the faint sweetness of the baking, moved through the warm air in the way that good evenings do, as though the evening itself is trying to ensure you notice it properly. Clara looked across at Roscoe. He was watching James trying to convince Frances to eat the extra piece of cake he did not want, which Frances was calmly declining, and his expression was the one he had in the evening when the day had been good and everyone was gathered and he was simply aware of where he was and what it contained. It was a quiet expression, unhurried, entirely at peace. He caught her looking, his mouth curved. "What are you thinking?" he asked, the way he sometimes did, the echo of a question asked years ago by a fire in a different place. "That I'm glad I stood at that bank door early," she said. He reached over the arm of his rocking chair and took her hand the way he did things without ceremony, just because it was what he wanted to do. His hand was warm and familiar and entirely right. "I'm glad I came by early," he said. Maddie, who had the hearing of a barn cat and the opinion-sharing instincts to match, said from her chair without looking up from her cake, "You two are very sentimental." "We are," Clara agreed. "It is not a criticism," Maddie said, with the particular grace note of a daughter who has grown up surrounded by the daily evidence of what a genuine love actually looks like and knows exactly what it's worth. The evening deepened, and the stars came out over the valley one by one, the enormous western sky doing what it always did this time of year, putting on a display so extravagant it seemed designed to remind the people beneath it of precisely how large everything was and how fortunate they were to be small inside it. James fell asleep against Clara's arm and Frances fell asleep in her chair, and Maddie sat with her feet on the railing and looked at the stars with the face of a young woman who is standing at the edge of her own life and knows it and is glad. Clara held her sleeping son's weight against her side and felt Roscoe's hand in hers, and thought about a morning in September of 1878, when she had stood on a boardwalk in front of a door that had not yet opened, holding everything she had and everything she was afraid of losing, rehearsing words she had said 17 times in front of a cracked mirror. She thought about the sound of boots on the boardwalk behind her. The way he had said, without knowing a single thing about her except what mattered, that he would back whatever she was about to say. She had thought on that morning that she was on the very edge of something. She had been right. She just had not known yet that the edge was the beginning and not the end. Roscoe squeezed her hand. She squeezed back. The stars filled the whole sky over the Sullivan Valley, and the ranch was quiet and full, and Clara Winslow Sullivan, who had stood at the doors before they opened, and had said what she had to say and had been backed up and had fought for her land and loved this man, and raised these children on this ground under this enormous, generous sky, let out a long, slow breath and felt, down to her bones, that everything had arrived exactly where it was supposed to be. It had come true, the whole long good thing of it, 1 inch at a time, the way everything worth having does, through steadiness and honesty and the willingness to stand at a door before it opens and say what you mean and let someone stand beside you while you do.